Most people believe that failure is born from a lack of luck, from the world's injustices, or from the absence of opportunities. But true failure doesn't begin on the outside. It is born within, silent, subtle, infiltrated into the thoughts that the mind repeats every day without noticing. The defeated person is not the one who falls, but the one who feeds their own downfall with spiritual conviction. It's curious to observe how human consciousness sabotages itself using its own creative power. The individual speaks of energy, quotes universal laws, repeats phrases about self-knowledge, but remains trapped in the same old stories. The mind convinces itself that it's awakening, when in reality it's only reorganizing old fears in a more sophisticated way. It's failure disguised as spirituality. Many believe they carry heavy karmas or difficult destinies, but rarely realize they are the authors of the repetitions that imprison them. The psychology of the failure-prone is ingenious. It creates spiritual justifications for stagnation, feeds victimhood, transforms guilt into virtue and fear into prudence. All of this with the appearance of wisdom. The failed mind doesn't live in the present. It lives in invisible rituals of self-pity, in automatic thoughts of scarcity, in vibrations that repel what it claims to desire. And the most impressive thing is that it does this believing it's protected, as if avoiding its own light were an act of balance. In this video, what really happens inside this dense energy field where consciousness falls asleep and calls this sleep peace will be revealed. We'll explore the hidden mechanics of victimization, the inverted alchemy that transforms potential into weight, the silent addiction to the spiritual comfort zone, and the archetypes that sabotage the soul in silence. Those who understand what is about to be said will see their own reflection in this mirror, and perhaps, for the first time, realize that it was never the world that blocked them. It was just the mind, repeating invisible rituals, believing in old stories, and forgetting the power that was always there, waiting to be remembered. At some point in the journey of consciousness, the human being learns to hide behind their own pain. Victimization becomes a refuge, a spiritual comfort zone that masks the fear of assuming one's own power. When the mind plunges into this frequency, something silent happens. Vital energy begins to contract. It's not divine punishment, but a direct reflection of the vibrational density that the individual sustains by repeating to themselves that they are wronged by the universe. Each thought of self-pity becomes a link in this invisible chain that traps the soul in cycles of repetition. The failed mind operates within this field. It creates emotional narratives that reinforce unworthiness. It whispers internally that success is a privilege of others, that life is hard, that destiny is already sealed. This programming is not just psychological, but energetic. The vibrational field of someone who believes they are a victim closes like a fortress of self-defense. Inside it, no new frequency can enter. No opportunity approaches, because the vibration itself repels any possibility of expansion. This pattern is so subtle that it disguises itself as spirituality. The person begins to see themselves as a suffering soul, as if pain were a sign of purity, a kind of karmic merit. They confuse learning with punishment and begin to justify each fall as part of a mysterious plan that never reveals itself. However, this posture keeps them trapped in a kind of trance. A trance where suffering becomes identity and vital energy turns to sustaining the role of victim. When thought constantly feeds on the idea that life is unfair, the energetic body loses brightness. The flow of prana that should circulate freely becomes thick, heavy, and the aura reflects this weight in opaque tones. The doors that lead to new experiences simply don't open, because the dominant frequency is one of resistance and fear. And while the mind convinces itself that the world is against it, the soul only observes, patient, waiting for the moment when the being will decide to break its own spell. In this state, victimization becomes a form of inverted power. It's an unconscious attempt to control reality through guilt and pity. The mind believes that if it remains suffering enough, the universe will finally take pity and grant what it desires. But the universe doesn't respond to pain, it responds to vibration. And the victim's vibration is static, self-centered, imprisoned by itself. This prison has no physical walls, but it's so dense that it can cross generations. Emotional inheritances are passed down as if they were survival lessons. Life is hard, no one helps, God forgot about me. These phrases become mantras that shape the family energy field, perpetuating the cycle. Until someone awakens and realizes that suffering is not destiny, it's just a choice repeated many times. Liberation begins when consciousness recognizes that victimhood is a distorted mirror of one's own creation. In that instant, a spark of lucidity emerges. It's the beginning of the alchemical turn, the point where the soul begins to perceive that it always had the power to transmute its reality. And it's precisely at this point, where the weight begins to dissolve, that the process of inverted alchemy reveals itself, the instant when inner gold begins to be transformed into lead. Every mind carries alchemical potential. Within it rests the capacity to transform experiences into wisdom, pain into expansion, chaos into consciousness. However, when thought becomes distorted by limiting beliefs, this natural process reverses. The failed mind, instead of elevating energy and refining perception, initiates an alchemy in reverse, a sophisticated self-sabotage mechanism that transforms spiritual gold into psychic lead. Gold represents the purest potential of the soul, intuition, creativity, the impulse for growth. But when the individual disconnects from their own worth, they begin to reinterpret these higher forces as threats. An internal movement of denial then emerges. The person desires change, but fears what change demands. They desire to prosper, but distrust success. They want to love, but feel they don't deserve to be loved. This contradiction creates an unstable vibrational field, and all elevated energy is immediately drained, converted into emotional weight. The failed mind feeds this cycle with destructive internal dialogues. It silently repeats that it's not capable, that it wasn't born for this, that it already tried and failed. Each of these affirmations functions as an energetic command. It's as if the being plants fertile seeds of possibilities and immediately covers them with mental ashes. Inverted alchemy happens there, when luminous thought is contaminated by fear and doubt. The energy that should ascend to the field of spirit solidifies in the emotional field, creating density and exhaustion. In this state, the individual begins to use spirituality as rationalization for their own blockage. They interpret challenges as punishments and opportunities as tests. Everything becomes a labyrinth where the logic of limitation prevails. The universe continues sending signals, but perception distorts them. What could be a portal of expansion is treated as a threat to the comfort zone. The mind prefers the familiarity of pain to the uncertainty of evolution. This inverted alchemy doesn't happen overnight. It's cultivated in small doses of daily self-sabotage. A thought of discouragement here, a comparison with others there, and the energy field becomes disorganized. The result is a life pattern that seems fixed, immutable, as if destiny were locked. But destiny is not a sentence, it's a frequency. And as long as the being continues vibrating in self-denial, they will continue experiencing realities that confirm this belief. The failed mind convinces itself that it's being realistic. But deep down, it only fears its own light. Because if the light were to turn on completely, there would be no more excuses, no dramas to justify stagnation. Lead is comfortable because it keeps the being anchored in what they know. Gold, on the other hand, demands surrender, demands dying to the old identity. And it's at this point that many give up, believing they're being prudent, when in reality they're just resisting their own evolution. While inner gold transforms into lead, a new dependency begins to be born, the silent addiction to the spiritual comfort zone, where the mind creates mystical justifications for not changing. When the failed mind becomes accustomed to living in density, it begins to confuse imprisonment with security. A peculiar type of addiction emerges, attachment to inertia. The spiritual comfort zone is not a place of peace, but an altered state of consciousness where the individual feels protected from their own transformation. In this space, the fear of growing disguises itself as wisdom, and complacency gains the appearance of inner balance. It's common to see people saying that things happen when they're meant to happen, but what lies behind this phrase often is the fear of acting. The fear of seeing oneself in motion, of being responsible for one's own creation, leads to an anesthesia of will. The being begins to believe they're waiting for the right moment, but the right moment never comes, because consciousness is trapped in a closed circuit of justification. The universe responds to this state with silence, because there's no vibrational emission of purpose, only passivity. The mind, at this stage, becomes a master at creating arguments for not moving forward. It speaks of karma, of destiny, of external energies that block the path. And the more it convinces itself of these stories, the further it distances itself from inner truth. Karma, which should be a learning instrument, is transformed into a crutch. Destiny, which is flexible, becomes a sentence. Everything becomes an explanation for immobility. Consciousness becomes accustomed to observing life as if it were a spectacle that happens to it, not through it. The most curious thing is that this stagnation is comfortable. There's a relief in remaining within the known, even if the known hurts. Predictable suffering seems safer than freedom that demands courage. The failed mind feeds on this paradox. It complains about its own prison, but fears the opening of the door. With each attempt to change, it activates the fear mechanism, remembering the times it tried and failed, reinforcing the idea that, it's not the moment, I'm not ready, the energy hasn't aligned yet. This autosuggestion becomes a form of spiritual anesthesia. The being stops moving, but believes they're evolving. They meditate, read about awakening, speak of energy and expansion, but all in an intellectualized way. The real practice of transformation, the confrontation with one's own shadows, the abandonment of old habits, is constantly postponed. Thus, failure ceases to be just a result and becomes a comfortable identity. The addiction to the spiritual comfort zone is treacherous because the individual believes they're awake while sleeping with open eyes. They speak about consciousness, but their own consciousness feeds on the fear of change. This is the deepest root of failure, the mind that protects itself from evolution using the language of spirituality. And in this fertile field of illusions, powerful psychic figures begin to emerge, internal archetypes that feed the drama and perpetuate the cycle. They are invisible entities that live within the mind and dominate decisions without the being noticing. They form the hidden army of the self-saboteur. When consciousness disconnects from its creative force and surrenders to the repetitions of fear, internal forms emerge that take on a life of their own. They are the shadow archetypes of the self-saboteur, expressions of the psyche that operate in the shadows, manipulating choices, emotions, and perceptions. Each of them is born from a misunderstood need, and all share the same purpose: to keep the soul imprisoned in the familiar territory of failure. The first of them is the martyr, the one who carries the pride of suffering. They believe that pain makes them special, that being unhappy is a sign of spiritual depth. The martyr refuses help, because deep down they take pleasure in proving to the world the magnitude of their resistance. They live off unnecessary sacrifices and hide behind misinterpreted compassion. They feed on others' attention, and their vibration creates a dense field where suffering is romanticized. Each time they say, "I can handle everything," they reinforce the energetic chain that keeps them chained to pain. Right beside them operates the victim. Unlike the martyr, the victim doesn't seek to be admired, but understood. They collect injustices like medals, recite past misfortunes as if they were prayers. In their narrative, the world is always the executioner and they, the eternal innocent. The victim is cunning. They know how to awaken empathy and use this energy as nourishment. But this nourishment has a high price. Each time someone comforts them, they reaffirm their own role in the theater of suffering. Their vital energy is drained to sustain the plot that nothing works out for me. And then emerges the saboteur, the most silent and dangerous of all. They hide under the disguise of prudence, whispering that it's better not to try, that failure hurts less when avoided. The saboteur acts in moments of transition, when the being is about to break a cycle. They whisper doubts, remind of old mistakes, activate forgotten guilt. Their function is to ensure that nothing changes, that the gold of consciousness continues being transformed into lead. And while fulfilling their role, the being believes they're being rational, when in reality they're being guided by the most primitive fear, the fear of seeing themselves free. These archetypes coexist, feed on each other, and strengthen one another. The martyr needs the victim to justify their sacrifice. The victim needs the saboteur to ensure that nothing improves, and the saboteur needs both to continue existing. Together, they form a self-sustaining psychic system that consumes creative energy and transforms it into resistance. The mind, in this state, becomes an invisible battlefield where the soul tries to express itself, but is constantly muffled by internal voices that convince it to remain small. And while these characters dominate the internal stage, external life reflects the same script. Repetitive relationships, missed opportunities, unfinished projects. Nothing flows because the energetic command that directs the experience still comes from the shadows. The soul tries to speak through signs, a synchronicity, a premonition, an encounter, but the mind, taken by these archetypes, interprets everything as coincidence. Thus, the universe continues sending invitations to awakening, and consciousness, prisoner of itself, continues refusing all of them. But when silence finally settles in, when the being begins to hear something beyond the internal voices, a new perception begins to emerge. The recognition arises that true suffering is not in the pain, but in the disconnection from the purpose that the soul chose before coming to matter. And it's in this instant of lucidity that the journey continues to a deeper void, the void of forgetting one's own purpose. In many paths of consciousness, the being awakens to a void difficult to name. Everything continues happening on the surface. Routines continue, commitments are fulfilled, words about spirituality flow naturally. However, something within remains mute, distant, as if the essence were watching life from afar. This state doesn't represent punishment, but rather a distancing from the vibrational center that sustains true purpose. The soul's energy pulses at a subtle frequency, aligned with the joy of serving one's own destiny. When the mind becomes dense through fear, self-sabotage, or guilt, this attunement breaks. The individual begins to confuse movement with purpose, effort with direction. They work, seek answers, multiply activities, but the internal field remains opaque. The sensation of being alive loses strength because the soul's original flow has been replaced by the attempt to control everything through thought. In this scenario, the inner calling continues active, though muffled. Small signs emerge: a constant discomfort, loss of enthusiasm, the impression that something essential was left behind. The universe tries to speak through synchronicities, meaningful encounters, creative impulses that appear and are soon ignored. The mind interprets these signs as distractions, while the heart recognizes in them the invitation to return to the axis. Disconnection from soul purpose doesn't mean lack of spirituality. Many traverse this state believing they're in deep awakening, reading about expansion, speaking of energy, participating in rituals and meditations. However, the practice becomes mechanical, without presence. The search for the sacred turns into distraction. Spirituality, at this point, transforms into a disguise for fleeing from self-knowledge. The soul observes with patience. It doesn't punish nor absent itself. It only awaits the instant when the being decides to hear it again. The reunion doesn't depend on complex techniques, but on silence and inner honesty. One need only cease the noise of justifications and the flow begins to return. In this instant, meaning pulses again, and the natural magnetism of consciousness reappears, attracting circumstances aligned with the true path. However, before realignment establishes itself, the mind tries to regain control. Old habits emerge, automatic thoughts and small mental repetitions that sabotage awakening. These subtle gestures form invisible rituals, daily repetitions that feed the same pattern of limitation. It's at this point that the next stage of the failed mind reveals itself, the unconscious ritual of self-sabotage. Every thought is an invocation. The human mind, by its very nature, acts as a field of constant creation. Each repeated emotion, each phrase spoken quietly, each image cultivated in silence molds the invisible fabric of reality. The failed mind is unaware of this force and, without realizing it, uses it to sustain its own failure. Its prayers are negative, its mantras are complaints, and its rituals disguise themselves as daily habits. Awakening happens every morning, but even before the body rises, the mind already restarts the cycle. It's going to be difficult, nothing changes, I can't do it. These affirmations are like vibrational codes that program the energy field to repeat the past. The day hasn't even begun, and the energy has already been defined by the frequency of discouragement. Then come the catastrophic visualizations, memories of past failures, and internal dialogue that reinforces fear. With each repetition, the pattern strengthens. The unconscious ritual also follows in small gestures. The gaze that avoids the mirror, the thought that compares, the physical posture that curves. Everything communicates something to the quantum field of creation. The mind sends orders to the universe through the predominant feeling. And the universe only responds. What the being projects with conviction, they inevitably experience. Thus, self-sabotage ceases to be a psychological accident and becomes a precise energetic process, sustained by misdirected attention. The power that creates the outer world is the same that keeps the inner world trapped. The difference lies in the direction of energy. The individual who has become accustomed to thinking about failure keeps the vibration of failure active. Even in silence, even in apparent serenity, the field vibrates in resistance. No manifestation technique works while thought continues committed to scarcity. The failed mind believes it's asking for prosperity, but what it emits, in reality, is lack. Each destructive thought is a vibrational signature registered on the subtle plane. Consciousness sends this record to the field, and the field responds by materializing equivalent circumstances. It's an invisible pact, renewed daily without conscious intention. True imprisonment is not in external conditions, but in the unconscious repetition of beliefs that the mind itself chose to defend. Breaking this cycle requires vigilance and presence. Silent observation of one's own thoughts already initiates the liberation process. The instant the individual perceives what they repeat, the frequency begins to modify. Self-sabotage loses force, because the ritual is interrupted. No pattern survives the light of awakened consciousness. Awakening is not a distant mystical event, it's an internal gesture of attention. The being who learns to perceive their mental rituals discovers that failure was never destiny, but only an unconscious creation maintained for years. The mind, now more lucid, begins to dissolve old pacts and recover the power to choose new frequencies. It's the beginning of a silent reconstruction, a gradual return to the axis of the soul. The cycle closes and, at the same time, opens. Failure loses its function, and the spirit rediscovers the direction of its own light. Each person who crosses through the cycle of victimization, self-sabotage, and disconnection stands before a choice: continue nurturing their own prison or begin to dissolve the invisible pacts that sustain suffering. This choice doesn't require supernatural courage, it requires presence. It requires looking at one's own reflection without disguises and recognizing that creative power never stopped pulsing within the being. The question is simple, but powerful. Do you still want to sustain the character who suffers, or are you ready to let your consciousness retake control? The answer changes everything. Because in the instant the mind decides to free itself, the energy field reorganizes, and the universe responds. Reality becomes once again a mirror of what you vibrate, not of what you fear. If this message awakens something within you, if at some point in this video your heart felt it needed to hear this, don't ignore the impulse. Transform the insight into action. Begin by observing your own mental rituals, silence the destructive dialogue, and see what happens when thought becomes an ally of the soul. Expansion begins in simple steps. And if you want to continue walking this path of consciousness, subscribe to the channel and activate notifications. Every week, new reflections, new provocations, and new reminders of the power that already dwells within you. The universe doesn't close itself to those who awaken, it only awaits the first gesture of presence.